Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for that very warm welcome. I'm so excited to be able to speak with you all this morning about something that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to give you a brief background of who I am so you understand the lens from which I am approaching this work. I am a social worker. I'm trained as a psychotherapist, and I've been practicing for over 20 years. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this wonderful organization that I work with and is very near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to go ahead and start to share my slides with you. And I really want to invite you to make some comments, questions in that Q&A box. This is definitely an opportunity to have an interactive conversation. I'm someone who is very relational and I love having conversation. So I have been at the Austin Child Guidance Center. I'm actually celebrating my 21st anniversary this year. And I am in the position of Chief Strategy and Program Officer. Almost 10 years ago, I also started the Trauma Informed Care Consortium of Central Texas. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about TIC at the end of our time together. But this is essentially a group of over 100 organizations that have come together to educate the community about what trauma is, how it impacts the developing brain, and ways that we as a community can be more supportive and responsive to youth, family, and parents who have experienced a traumatic event. So the great thing about Austin Child Guidance Center is that we provide direct services, but we are very, very heavily involved in making community level change. So we absolutely want to help one family at a time, but we also want to shift the culture and environment in our community. Austin Child Guidance Center is one of the oldest children's mental health organizations in Central Texas. We're actually located on the corner of 45th and Lamar, and we've brought many firsts to the community. Not only were we one of the first child-serving mental health organizations, we actually brought the first child psychiatrist to the city many moons ago, and we're one of the first trauma-informed organizations as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about what that really means, because even in the therapy world, there are still sort of misunderstandings about that. But Austin Child Guidance Center offers a variety of different services. This includes individual and family therapy. We serve kids through the age of 17 in the context of working with their parents. We know that parents are with their kids all the time. They are the most influential persons in a child's life. So our goal is to really help and support parents alongside with providing therapy to their child. We also offer these wonderful free parent workshops. Those are located on our website at austinchildguidance.org. We offer trainings like this in the community as well. We also have a psychiatric nurse practitioner who can prescribe medications for clients that we are seeing in therapy services. So these are clients that maybe are seeking medications for things like depression or anxiety or ADHD, and they're in counseling at ACGC as well. Another unique service that we provide at Austin Child Guidance Center is psychological assessments. And these assessments can help a parent and a child understand what the child's strengths may be, but also if they're having any, for example, academic challenges or social emotional challenges. And then these assessments also provide recommendations of how we can best support that child. So Austin Child Guidance Center does a variety of different services. We are also providing these services in a hybrid model in person as well as via telehealth. So we're providing services that way. And we also have a walk-in clinic. And that essentially means that the families would just contact the center to see what availability is to receive a walk-in session. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So in our time together today, this is our general agenda. We're going to talk about what stress is versus what trauma is. I'm going to briefly touch base on mental health trends that we've been seeing, not only in Texas, but really across the United States. And this is such an important conversation, particularly in the context of COVID. And then I'm also going to talk about interventions that people can use. So these are things that parents can use. If you're a teacher, you can use these interventions. These are also interventions that you can use with yourself if you notice that you are having a lot of stress, anxiety. And then I'm also going to talk about the times that you would really need to refer or come seek out a mental health professional, particularly in those moments of crisis. So I want to talk briefly about stress. And stress is something that is unavoidable. We will all experience stress throughout our lives and throughout our day. And stress in and of itself is not necessarily something that is particularly negative. It can actually motivate us to get something done. If we're coming up, for example, on a deadline, we need to get something done, the pressure of that stress may encourage us to do those things. But what exactly is stress? So stress is your body reacting to change. You think of how we've been in COVID, we've been in throughout enormous amount of change. Stress can affect us mentally, physically, and emotionally. So stress can release cortisol in the body, which is a stress hormone. It can release in the body. And we need that during times of stress, during short-term periods of times of stress, because it helps us sort of armor up to do what we need to do. But long-term, that can be a problem. Some teens can perceive a situation as difficult. So at Awesome Child Guidance Center, I will say that trends that we have seen with kids who experience significant stress are around things like grades, sometimes school performance, sometimes the change or transition of a new school or changes within the family, just growing and developing and navigating new friendships. Those can all be very, very stressful things. So I want to talk a minute about healthy versus unhealthy stress. This is very important to note because, as I mentioned before, stress in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. So healthy or normal stress may be things like going away to college, having that intensity of playing, a big sports game and really wanting to win, a deadline at work or school. Holidays can always be stressful. Sometimes that does tend for lots of parents actually to move into unhealthy stress because there tends to be a lot of financial stress associated with the holidays, getting things done, making sure that everyone has a wonderful time. And we also hear a lot from kids that driver's ed in and of itself can be stressful. So the process of learning how to drive, navigating a new car, and eventually getting your driver's license and just taking on basically a new skill can be stressful. Unhealthy stress is where things really move towards significant excessive worrying. So it's so normal for kids to worry about school, worry about how they're doing in school, sometimes worry about their performance in school, but it becomes really unhealthy when the worry becomes so excessive, when the child is really ruminating, where you might notice that that kiddo is starting to experience a lack of sleep, has constant thoughts that won't stop. is starting to refuse to go to school. I mean, that's a big indicator. If they're starting to talk about symptoms that they're having in their body, lots of stomach aches, lots of headaches, or they just want to stop going to school. And that's typically when they're shifting into a coping skill called avoidance. So we want to get ahead of that pretty quickly, and we want to problem solve with that child so that we can potentially help them back in school. And there are lots of ways of doing that to help support that child and that family, including working with the school system in order to make sure that the classroom is a safe, welcoming place for kids. Let's talk about the effects of stress. So stress is real. It's not just a feeling that we have. I mean, frequently, if you ask someone like, how are you doing? Many people will say, I'm fine, or I'm okay, or I'm well. And then secondly, I often hear is I'm stressed or I'm busy. And what's important to note is that stress is a physiological response of the body. So you have probably likely experienced stress in the last couple of weeks. And what you might notice is that your muscles get tense. They may get tense in your shoulders or in your neck. For some people, they get tense in their jaw. So they might hold tension there, or it might be in different muscle parts of the body. You also may feel more fatigued than usual. So the act of sitting in stress long-term will actually tax your body. So even if you're in a state of not acting and doing a lot of things, the process of worry and the process of stress is very taxing on the brain and the body. It can actually make you feel very fatigued, which for some people is kind of confusing because they'll say, well, I didn't do much this weekend, but I did spend a lot of time worrying. We know that over long term that stress suppresses the immune system. You're more likely to get sick. So you're more likely to get a cold or any other virus or bacteria when your immune system is compromised. We also know that high levels of stress can also lead to gastrointestinal problems, sensitive stomach. You have probably heard with kids, especially, but teens too, having stomach problems. So it's not uncommon that people, especially young people, will somaticize stress and it will be experienced in their stomach. And for some people, long-term stress can cause an increase in blood pressure. That's really over a long period of time. So all of this to say is that, stress is not just an emotional reaction or a thought, but it is actually a physiological response in the body. So I want to talk for a minute about stress in teens, because it's particularly important to discuss how it impacts teens, which is a little bit differently than how it might impact young kids or even adults. Teens have gone through such a significant period of transition this last couple of years. They have had to experience social isolation, moving to online learning, to then in-school learning, to hybrid learning, which has all been very difficult for everybody involved, for teachers, for parents, for kids. So it's really been an enormously unprecedented time. So parents would really want to look for these types of symptoms, things like social withdrawal, being easily angered or irritated. I usually refer to this as just having a short fuse. So things that wouldn't normally get under their skin are starting to really get under their skin. Again, we might see an emergence of these physical health symptoms like stomach aches, headaches. You may even see more frequency of getting things like colds. Difficulty sleeping. This is a big one. And when we have families come to Austin Child Guidance Center who are experiencing significant levels of stress, anxiety, or even trauma, one of the first things that we will do is assess how sleep is going. Sleep is one of the most significant ways that we calm and regulate our brain, including our moods and our emotions. So we'll assess with sleep, and oftentimes we'll start there. We'll start with helping that child and family figure out how we can improve sleep. Oftentimes, if you're able to improve sleep, a lot of other things that youth is experiencing fall in line. You can also see difficulty concentrating, feeling jittery or jumpy, so having a hard time sitting still. And again, we also see tight or stiff muscles throughout the body. So I want to talk about the difference between stress and trauma, because it's really important to know the difference, especially if you have concerns about your child's mental health, to be informed of what those things might be. Ultimately, that assessment should take place by a licensed clinician who can help guide you through that process of really figuring out what's going on. So when people think of trauma, they frequently think of this. During World War II, we developed this definition called shell shock. And it was created after veterans were coming back from war and had experienced what we now would call post-traumatic stress disorder. This is what therapists often use in the lens of trauma. But what I tell people, especially when it comes to kids, is to have some awareness of this definition, but to kind of throw it out the window, because trauma can sometimes look exactly like post-traumatic stress disorder, but a lot of times it can look like feeling depressed, feeling anxious. It can even look like that kid who's having a hard time sitting down and focusing in class, that kid that maybe the teacher might peg as having attention deficit disorder may actually just be having a trauma response, maybe having difficulty focusing on things. Their body is in a highly stated arousal, and so they're having a difficulty sitting still for long periods of time. They've also done research with kids who were in the CPS system and removed from the home and placed outside of the home. And only a very small percentage of those children met the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that those kids have experienced at least one potentially traumatic event, and that is being removed from the home. That's incredibly traumatic. So I encourage folks, when they think about trauma, to think about it more in a global context, beyond just post-traumatic stress disorder. I want to talk briefly about the community impact of trauma, which it contributes to kids being in crisis. I'm going to share just a brief personal story with you. I was born in Southeast Texas, and I grew up in the Middle East. And my father, throughout his career, worked for Mobil Oil. He was the head of safety at the various plants and refineries that he worked at. And in the 70s, as I would get ready for school and sit at the breakfast table eating my Lucky Charms, my dad would open up his briefcase every morning. And in his briefcase was this black and white photo of a petrochemical explosion. In the 70s, there were various petrochemical plants that had explosions, that had fires that significantly impacted people. And two of his coworkers were impacted this one specific day. My father was actually out of state at a training. And one of his colleagues died as a result of this explosion. And one of his colleagues suffered severe, significant burns. He was months away from retirement. So in the petrochemical community, this was obviously an incredibly traumatic event. And it wasn't something that just happened that day, and then weeks or months later, people resolved it and moved on. But anytime the men that were involved that day, including their family, their kids were, maybe graduating high school or getting married or something momentous was happening in their lives, it was a constant reminder of the events that day. My father also suffered significant guilt. He often thought, gosh, what if I had been there that day? Maybe I could have prevented it. And a lot of the people that he worked with in the 70s when this happened had very similar feelings. In fact, so much so that they put so many safety precautions in place that it would not happen again. So my father looked at this photo every day for two reasons. One is that he never wanted to forget the lives impacted that day. This happened decades ago, and he still thinks about it. So he wanted to remember the lives that were impacted. The second reason that he looked at this every day is really one of the core values of creating a foundation of healthy relationships with our youth. And that is the importance of safety. Without safety, if kids don't feel safe in their homes or in their relationship with you or at their school, it's going to create an enormous amount of stress and can sometimes create trauma within the body. So whatever we need to do as a community, as leaders within systems of organizations, as supporters of kids, of parents of kids, as teachers of kids, to increase a sense of safety, it is so important to do. That in and of itself can help calm the brain and the body. I also want to talk briefly about collective trauma. And this is so important to highlight, particularly as we all have had a collective traumatic experience of going through COVID. And collective trauma refers to the psychological upheaval that is shared by a group of people who all experience an event. This type of trauma can affect groups of people of any size, including entire nations or societies. So COVID is one example of literally everyone around the globe experiencing a collective trauma at the same time. It doesn't mean that everyone is going to experience traumatic symptoms related to this, or that everyone experiences that traumatic event to the same degree. We know that there are things in place that would impact people more significantly than others. If you are coming from a place of privilege in terms of financial privilege, if you have resources, you may be significantly less impacted during times of COVID. So I'm going to talk a little bit more deeply about how trauma impacts various aspects of our life. And I'm going to talk briefly about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. This was a study that began in the 90s. And it began out of curiosity by an internist who worked at Kaiser in Southern California. His name is Dr. Vincent Felitti. And in the 90s, patients were coming to him hoping to lose weight. And so he would put them on a nutrition regime and an exercise regime, and he would help his patients lose weight. And what he noticed is frequently many of his patients had pretty significant success, but sometimes they would drop out or sometimes they would regain weight, and he was curious about that. So he would talk to his patients. He was a doctor who had a really good relationship with those that he served. And some of his patients, not all, but some of his patients shared with him that they had had significant trauma in their childhood, and that eating was a way to cope with painful emotional feelings for them. So he started to wonder if there was a correlation between what he was trying to do and helping some of his patients with weight challenges with childhood adversity. And so he partnered with Dr. Robert Anda at the Centers for Disease Control, and together they put together the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And what they did is they surveyed over 18,000 people in adulthood about their childhood experiences. So they asked them about 10 potentially traumatic events. So they said, have you experienced any of these things in childhood? And then what they did is they took the data from all of these adults who reported things that happened in childhood, and they correlated this data with health records. And they followed these patients for decades. So let me tell you a little bit about the subject pool that they studied. Most of the people in the study, over 75% of the people in the study, are college educated or have some college education. Over 75% of the people in the study are white. And all of the people in the study have Kaiser Health. They all have private health insurance. So this is a pretty privileged group of people. I think if you were to take a general snapshot of folks in our community, it would not look this great. So I'm going to briefly show you the results of the study. I'm going to point you over to the right-hand side. The types of adverse childhood experiences. These are the ones that Felitti and Anda looked at. So they looked at things like physical neglect, emotional abuse, incarceration of a parent, a caregiver treated violently, emotional abuse. They also looked at significant mental illness if a parent was really struggling with a mental illness. They looked to see if the person had been sexually abused as a child. The one below that is about parental separation. I actually looked at divorce. And since then, they actually have removed divorce as an adverse childhood experience, because we now know that divorce in and of itself is not necessarily traumatic. It's not even a bad thing. For many families, it's actually a movement towards being healthy. So that's been removed. And then they also looked at physical abuse and then substance use disorder by the parent. So these are the various adverse childhood experiences that the investigators looked at. The other thing to note is this graph on our left, which looks at the percentage of respondents reporting the number of adverse childhood experiences. And what we learned from the ACE study is, about 35% of people said, none of these things happened to me in childhood, which I think is kind of remarkable. I think if you go through childhood unscathed, that's remarkable. But what we did learn is the vast majority of people have experienced childhood trauma. Adverse childhood experiences are incredibly, incredibly common. They're so common, yet still there is such significant stigma associated with them that people often have difficulty seeking help when they really need it. So I'm going to talk briefly about the mental health challenges that have existed, particularly with COVID. I will tell you, just having been a practitioner for over 20 years and having worked at Austin Child Guidance Center for a really long time, we have seen more demand in mental health services than probably the history of my time practicing, at least in the last 20 years. There was over a 22% spike in ER trips for potential suicides by children aged 12 to 17 in the summer of 2020 compared to the year before. And this comes out of the CDC. So this is a huge spike. So we're seeing more kids who are presenting in hospitals with suicidal ideation. And the data around this was particularly alarming for girls from 12 to 17. Between February in March, emergency department visits for potential suicide attempts were up almost 50% compared to the same period in 2019, data showed. So this is having a really significant impact on girls. And there could be lots of different reasons associated to that. But what it does point to is that we need to be in a place where we're being proactive about the conversation around mental health, that we're supporting kids and families before kids get to the place of being suicidal. And if they do find themselves having thoughts of wishing to be dead or not wanting to be here, that they know that they can go to a parent, to a teacher, to a loved one, and openly talk about those thoughts and feelings so that we can be responsive and get that child help. We know that early intervention leads to significant recovery. So just because a child is feeling suicidal does not mean that they will feel that way forever, but it does mean that that child needs some professional help and support. So let's talk about what happens when we get scared. And we're talking about this really in the context of anything that really frightens us, along with stress, along with trauma, which can lead to things like depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts and feelings. So these are some slides actually that one of our clients found that when we were talking about like, what do people look like, or how did you feel when you were in that really stressful situation? So I love it when kids, when our youth come in and provide us with knowledge and information. So these are slides that, photos that they shared with us about like, this is what it feels like to feel stressed out, to feel really scared. And just to provide a little bit of context of these photos, these were taken actually in a haunted house. I believe there was like a train or something coming and a large screen coming towards people. But what you may notice is these folks are in a position of very heightened physical response, right? You can see their mouths are open. This woman in the front looks like she's about to run away. He looks like he's kind of frozen. These kids look like they're yelling. They're clearly all scared. They're shocked. So the challenge with trauma is that the brain and the mind stay in this exact state even when the scary or potentially traumatic event has been removed. This is how our brain is still functioning. It's functioning from a place of being terrified. So that's another difference between stress and trauma. Stress is usually pretty temporary. It can come and go in waves. Trauma, the symptoms of trauma stay even when the traumatic event has been resolved. I'm going to talk just really briefly, since I have the time, and I'm going to talk really briefly about the brain, because we know that trauma is a brain response. And we know that stress is a brain response. So we have various parts of our brain that help us do things like learn things, remember things, that help regulate our feelings and emotions. And so trauma, and this is a massive oversimplification, but I'm going to explain it in a way that I hope will be helpful to you. Trauma impacts the part of the brain, the temporal part of the brain that is comprised of a part of the brain that helps us regulate feelings and emotions. And it also includes a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is responsible for forming and retrieving memories. So this part of the brain is not functioning properly. We combine that with the front part of the brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that's located here. This part of your brain helps you think of consequences. It helps break down a project into smaller tasks. When a youth is presented with a problem, it helps them break down things so that they can do it step by step and reach small goals in order to reach a bigger goal. So this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is not fully functioning for most people until they're in their mid-20s. So when we see a kid who's growing up who's pretty impulsive, that's kind of natural. That's part of natural, normal brain development because their prefrontal cortex is not as matured as it is. So you may see your child, in your own child, or if you're a teacher at school, a kiddo who maybe is impulsive, says things without thinking, or maybe has a high emotional state. That is because their brain is functioning that way. That is a brain thing. So it is our responsibility as adults to help function as their prefrontal cortex. So we as adults are walking around helping kids function by us being their prefrontal cortex. So helping them break things down into smaller tasks. For us, it's so important for us to be calm and regulated no matter if a child is having a meltdown or having difficulty. Once we start to flip our own lids, that child will flip their lids along with us. So let's talk about what we can do. I'm going to give you some pretty pragmatic ideas. So when it comes to talking with your teen about stress, it's most important to listen with your full intention. Listening is a gift that we give to people, and it's particularly important with youth and teens because they have so many thoughts and feelings that they're trying to process. So knowing they have a trusted adult in their lives that they can take these things to is so important. Just acknowledging those feelings, nodding your head, letting them know that you're fully listening. To label their feelings so that they have a mirror that is you, providing to them what their emotional experiences are. Or if your child is reluctant to come directly to you, which by the way can sometimes be part of natural, normal development of a teen or a youth developing autonomy. It can be even under the best of circumstances with the most supportive, attuned parent, that a teen may just not open up. So making sure that that child does have a trusted person, whether that is another relative, a family friend, someone at your place of worship, or maybe even a therapist. What you do want to avoid is jumping in with a bunch of questions or peppering that child with a lot of advice. This is what you need to do, or this is how to change the situation around, or this is what I did when I was your age, or these are things that I have done to help me. It's one thing if the child's approaching and asking you for advice, and that's an open door, share. But otherwise, really, your goal is to support, sometimes to help problem solve as well. And it's really important not to approach your child when you yourself are feeling nervous. So you need to be in a calm state when you're approaching your child around difficult conversations. Otherwise, they're going to pick up on your energy and it's going to cause them to be more reluctant to share with you. So these are ways, healthy ways of coping with a variety of different challenges that youth are having. So these include things like problem solving, cognitive techniques. I'm going to talk briefly about this. This should actually be explored more deeply in therapy. Relaxation techniques and activities are just one-on-one time, which is so important and also really difficult to do in the busy world that we live in. Problem solving. So these are just some tips and strategies on how to help a kid who is maybe feeling stuck. And the most important thing is to start off by asking permission, asking the youth, would it be helpful if we walk through this, if I help problem solve with you, if I help walk you along in a conversation that can help come to a solution that might work for you. So, the first most important thing is to determine if this problem is solvable or if it's an unsolvable worry. And this is an important skill to learn both in as a youth, but as an adult, is can you fix this problem? Or is this more of a problem that we need to deal with in terms of managing our feelings and emotions that we may not have much control over? And then talking about the steps of problem solving. So identifying the problem, asking the youth if they can identify or come up with various solutions or options, really weighing those solutions or options, coming up with a plan. And then if the child wants to circle back around and evaluate the outcome. Is the thing that the parent and child settle on, is that the thing that actually worked? Or maybe we need to go back and revisit that list of possible solutions and options and make some adjustments. I also wanted just to briefly introduce a type of therapy that we offer at Austin Child Guidance Center, which is called cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT. And CBT is one of the most research-supported interventions for all sorts of challenges that we have with mental health. That includes anxiety, depression, trauma, a variety of different issues. And sort of the core of cognitive behavioral therapy is the knowledge that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected. The way that we think about something influences the way that we feel about it, and that influences how we act or how we respond. So a cognitive behavioral therapist can work closely with the youth and with the family to identify what thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are occurring, and if there are ways that we can shift things in any of these areas. It's also important to know when to seek help. The hardest job on the planet is being a parent. It's very difficult. A lot of times there are some very concrete strategies, but the implementation of these things is a very gray area. And oftentimes, especially during COVID, parents have felt really isolated. They've taken on more than they can actually do, any person can do. So it's important to know when to seek help. And by the way, seeking help and being in therapy is a part of good mental health. And mental health needs to be on the forefront of our minds right now. So if a child is showing significant decline in school performance, if they're showing symptoms of depression that are long-lasting, you notice that maybe they're irritable, they're sad, they're losing sleep, their appetite is changing. If they're having any thoughts of suicide or wishing not to be here, that's definitely a time when we need some intervention. If we're noticing that the anxiety is starting to get in the way of daily functioning, so if they're having a really hard time socializing with friends or reluctant to go to school, and then obviously if we're concerned about repeated use of drugs or alcohol, that would be a good time to talk with a professional just to get that assessed and to provide some support and intervention. I also just wanted to share a little information with you about the Trauma Informed Care Consortium of Central Texas. Our website is traumatexas.com, where you can get additional resources beyond the ones that we provide at Austin Child Guidance Center. We provide lots of information on the website. Some information includes resources, ways to get help, training information. Also, it includes our meeting information as well, if you'd ever like to attend a meeting. Also, I just wanted to share additional information with you about services that we provide at Austin Child Guidance Center. So we do provide no-cost counseling. This for English and Spanish speaking survivors of crime, so folks who have experienced traumatic stress. This includes counseling as well as case management services. So we provide more of a wraparound services for families. And then we also have a walk-in clinic, and we started this walk-in clinic a little over 10 years ago. And what we can do is if we don't have a regular ongoing open session for serving clients, they can call our intake line, see what sessions are available that week for a single session of therapy. Sometimes parents can come in to do one session of therapy, get some strategies and ideas of how to best support their child. They can even come back into walk-in the following week. But we really started this service as a way to be more responsive to families. I also just wanted to close out this presentation with a quote that one of our clients provided to us. And this was a 13-year-old youth who had been in significant crisis. She was the victim of trafficking. She experienced horrible and significant abuse for years. She came to Austin Child Guidance Center and worked with a therapist, worked with me for several months, and her trauma symptoms abated. She started to be able to sleep again. She started to be able to trust people again. And she wanted to use her life experience to help other youth. And so this is the quote that she found that really symbolized her journey of recovery. When the Japanese men broke in objects, they aggrandized the damage by filling the cracks with gold. They believe that when something suffered damage and has a history, it becomes more beautiful. So I think in the context of knowing about this collective traumatic experience of COVID, that many, many, many youth have been significantly impacted in a negative way around this collective traumatic experience that has occurred, is for us to also remind ourselves that with the right interventions and the right support, that children and families and parents are incredibly resilient and can come out on the other side of this with new support, new skills, and they can come out with a sense of hope as well. These are additional resources that I would encourage you to check out and that are included in my PowerPoint today. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a ton of free resources. There are lots of handouts for parents that they can download for free that are in a variety of different languages, as well as the National Council for Behavioral Health. Again, my name is Shauna Crosby, and this is my email address. So if I can be of any service to any of you in the future, if you have any questions today about today's webinar, need assistance beyond what NAMI can provide in terms of services, please reach out to me. I love connecting with people in the community, and I really welcome that opportunity. So please take down my email address and let me know if I can be of service to you. So this marks the end of my webinar. I did want to go back into the chat and see if there were any other questions. So Mary, hi Mary, was wondering about what it means to be a trauma-informed organization or school. And that's such a great question, Mary. So in order to be in an organization that is truly trauma-informed, it means several different things. It means everyone within that school or organization needs to be trained on what trauma is and how it impacts the developing brain. So that means that teachers need to know how to be aware of what trauma triggers are, what to do in those times that a child might be triggered or flipping their lid, ways that they can respond to that. It also means that the organization needs to set up supports for the staff. So if you're in a mental health organization, that means supporting the therapist. If you're in a school, it means supporting teachers, so that if traumatic events occur, and they will and they do, that staff feel supported, that they have supports in order to do those things. And then if you're a mental health organization, or if you're a medical home, if you work at a pediatric group, It's very important to screen kids for trauma, and there are a variety of different ways you can do it, including blind screenings that sometimes they do in pediatric homes. So asking families, has your child experienced significant trauma? We're going to make this part of a regular conversation of bringing your child to see the pediatrician. And if so, would you like referrals? Can we connect you to a place that can help support you? We need to work towards destigmatizing trauma. It's so common. And we need to destigmatize seeking out mental health services. They should literally be part of everyone's evolution, particularly as a parent. So I'm seeing a question from Catherine. As a supportive prevention service organization, how can we help community groups increase from being trauma informed to becoming actively trauma supportive in a healing environment? So I would say there are a few ways of doing that. I would encourage you to join the Trauma Informed Care Consortium in Central Texas, where you'll be surrounded by other organizations that are going through that process. What it does take for an organization is that they have to do a self-assessment. So the organization has to do an external assessment is great too, to look at what the organization is doing well, as well as blind spots. And this is an ongoing evolution. So we have started down the path of becoming trauma informed in, I think it was 2010, maybe before that. And it is an ongoing conversation. We are always looking and tweaking our processes, our policies. We're always doing trainings. For years we were focused on client care, and then we shifted for a year to focus on staff care. So if you go to the SAMHSA website and look up TIP 57, that's TIP 57, there is a whole free booklet on becoming a trauma-informed organization that also includes ways to do shifting within an organization. And then I'm going to end just by saying one thing, because I'm realizing we're at time, is if you want to really make a significant impact in a community, and we've done that in Austin Travis County, is you have to get the leaders of the community on board. So that means that you have to be working with the county and the city to make sure that their strategic planning includes things like trauma-informed indicators, that you have buy-in from the Commissioner's Court, which we do. They have supported services like this for a very long time. So we've been really fortunate in Austin Travis County to have that support to make that collective impact change. So we've been able to make change not only with individual families, with organizations, but also as a community as a whole. So I know we're at time. As the therapist in me, I'm going to go ahead and end. Please take my email address, and if you have any additional questions, I would love to answer those for you or meet you for a coffee or whatever would be helpful to you. So I want to thank NAMI for inviting us to present on this such important topic today. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your time today as well. And just to close out, just a reminder, if you enjoyed this Mind Matters presentation, it will be available online, and that our next one will be April 7th, in which two of our NAMI Central Texas volunteers who have lived experience with their own mental health conditions will share their stories of their mental health conditions and provide messages of hope through storytelling. Thank you so much.